We're diving into a story today that is just incredibly intense. We're not looking at the fall of the Ming Dynasty through the eyes of emperors or generals. No, we're looking at it from the ground level. We're following one desperate family living in a village with no name worth remembering. This is really a masterclass in human resilience, and it shows us exactly how everyday people navigate the absolute worst catastrophes history can throw at them.
Listen to this. The famine arrived the way catastrophe always arrives in villages. Gradually, then all at once. Let that sink in for a second. It's a chilling reality, right? Before everything just totally falls apart, there's this creeping dread. What had always been dry dirt turned into something beyond dry, just this fine powder. The wind lifted it up, blew it into the corners of every hovel, into the folds of clothes, and straight into the lungs of anyone who stepped outside. Today, we're going to explore what it actually means to live through that terrifying moment when the gradual suddenly shifts to all at once.
Okay, Section 1, A World Born Dying, the Macro Collapse.
So, our story starts with a boy born in 1627. This is the very first year of the Chongjin Emperor's reign. And this kid had absolutely no way of knowing he had just arrived at the worst possible moment in history. The drought strangling the North China Plain, it was gearing up to be the worst one in 1,500 years. The harvests in 1628 and 1629 were total disasters. By 1630, there was literally nothing to harvest. Zero. And then, by 1631, a quiet, deadly fever just sweeps through the village, picking off anyone whose body had basically already given up the fight.
You have to picture what the emperor's reign looked like at this point. It was essentially being crushed by these massive historical forces. Decades of war against the Jurchen tribes pushing in from the northeast, that had completely gutted the imperial treasury. The severe drought we just talked about wiped out the tax base, and soldiers were deserting by the thousands. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, massive floods and earthquakes were ripping through Shanxi and Henan. The government was in absolutely no position to care if a local village was eating. And this brilliantly illustrates a core truth about empires. Collapse moves slowly at the top, but man, it moves incredibly fast at the bottom.
Section 2, The Palace and the Dust, the Micro-Reality.
Let's zoom in a bit. You've got this stark juxtaposition, and it was basically the central fact of this young boy's life. His village only existed because the forgotten palace next door needed it to. Inside those palace walls, kitchens were still cooking, guards were still shouting. Heck, the waste washing out of the palace drainage grates had more food in it than the entire village saw in a week. Meanwhile, outside the walls, it's just dust in your lungs, abandoned homes, and starvation. The whole empire is collapsing, but the palace still ate. Moving to Section 3, a slow subtraction, the family's decline. Now, for a little while, the boy's father, working as a palace servant, kept them afloat. But when that arrangement started to fail, it wasn't some sudden, dramatic event. It was what we're going to call a slow subtraction, just a gradual, devastating loss of health. It starts with an autumn cough, then it gets worse over the winter. The mornings start taking longer. And finally, in the winter of the boy's 8th year, his dad just sits by the door. He can't go to work anymore. The resignation sets in. So the mother keeps working. She's this deeply practical woman, keeping her head down, walking through those palace gates every morning and coming back every night. But here's the reality of her wages. She's paid in tiny amounts of grain. It was barely enough to feed 2 healthy people, and it was certainly not enough to keep a sick man alive who desperately needed extra nourishment. The whole system keeping them alive is breaking down.
Section 4, The 8-Year-Old's Choice, Taking Action.
8. Just take a second to really absorb that. 8 years old. That is how old this boy was when he realized that if his family was going to survive, he had to step up. He's just a child absorbing the brutal logic of a dying world and deciding that he's the only one left who can do anything about it. So how exactly does an 8-year-old do that? Well, he relied on this unspoken philosophy he learned from watching his mother. She taught him, choose what to look at it completely. In desperate times, you literally cannot afford to look at the big picture. It'll crush you. You have to radically narrow your focus to what actually matters for survival, and you commit to it 100%.
Let's move to how this actually builds into action, because he was incredibly methodical. Step 1, show up at the gates at dawn. Step 2, when the completely exhausted overseer asks if he can carry things, clean up, and keep his mouth shut, the kid just says yes to all 3. Step 3, the overseer literally crosses out the sick father's name in the ledger and writes the 8-year-old boy's name right next to it.
So I want to pose this to you. What happens when an 8-year-old kid walks into the belly of this massive, cold, failing institution to save his parents? He's in there carrying water, sweeping the courtyards, and keeping his mom's advice burning in his mind. Which brings us to Section 5, the weight of scraps, strategy inside the walls.
Once he's inside, he needed a strategy. And crucially, that strategy was absolutely not theft. Stealing from the palace ends badly, and ending badly isn't an option. So he watched. He watched how the food moved, what was used, what was thrown away. Look at the progression here. In month 1, he just does his backbreaking labor and casually introduces himself to the head kitchen servant. By month 2, he has made himself so unbelievably useful in those kitchens that the garbage, the bruised fruit, the stale bread, is officially his to carry out.
So the crucial point is this. Necessity in a collapsing world is the closest thing to security that exists. He made himself necessary. He carried those scraps home in his hands every single evening. And no, it wasn't a feast, but it was enough. It was enough to cure his father's cough. It was enough to keep the 3 of them alive.
Section 6, a fragile kind of survival. The zoom out.
Now we need to zoom back out for a second, because while the boys secured this tiny little lifeline inside the palace, the world outside was still a nightmare. The Chongqing drought didn't magically break. It would actually outlast the entire Ming Dynasty. Meanwhile, Li Xicheng's rebel armies are gathering out in Shaanxi, armies that are eventually going to wipe that forgotten palace off the map. It's a terrifying reminder that history moves completely indifferent to our small personal struggles.
And that's why we really have to ground ourselves in this reality. This wasn't a triumph. We always want survival stories to be these glorious cinematic victories. But in truly desperate times, survival is just doing the immediate and the necessary. It didn't fix the collapsing empire. But for that winter, the boy and his mom came home, the dad was at the door, and they ate.
He had looked, he had acted, they had eaten. That right there is the whole thing. That sums up the incredibly narrow, unglamorous success of this kid. He learned super early that the space between survival and starvation is terrifyingly thin. Which leaves us with this final massive question to think about. How narrow is the space between survival and its opposite when the sheer weight of history is bearing down on you? This boy survived because he narrowed his focus to the absolute essentials. So what would you choose to look at if you had to look at it completely? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, keep looking closely, and I'll see you next time.